the first short story, like I said, Joe Delaney, he's the stand-in for William March in this case. He's going to write a book about Company K. Thing I think, and I'm going to probably read from it a little bit because it's or Delaney rather talking to his wife, and she's talking about how there are some things that are just too horrible to put in the book. Let me just find it real quick. All right. Well, I'll read this part because it's probably one of my favorites in the whole book, and I think it does capstone March's thoughts on the First World War. I repeated my thoughts to my wife, but she said it was not difficult to understand about battlefields. The blood of the men killed on the field and the bodies buried there fertilize the ground and stimulate the growth of vegetation. That was all quite natural, she said. But I could not agree with this too simple explanation. To me, it has always seemed that God is so sickened with men and their unending cruelty to each other that he covers the place where they have been as quickly as possible. And that's the end of the first little vignette. And throughout the book, and I don't know, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, John, but throughout the book, it does, he talks about war as this massive tragedy, but also not in the same way that a Dalton Trumbo would write it. There's legitimacy there, where I think, especially, I think whenever you think about hesitancy to go to war or just like anti-war demonstration, you think about hippies, you think about people who have not experienced war and they think that there's some sort of expert on it. Maybe I'm not being clear enough, but you were a Marine, so I'm sure that you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's also, there's an early story in one of those little vignettes where he talks, one of the privates is repeating essentially the propagandistic material that they're given about how they're going to fight this war and it's going to be the war to end all wars and it'll bring peace to the world and they're going to defeat these evil Germans, right? And so I think you see that beginning stage of like not hesitancy but the eagerness to go to war, and by the end of the book, as you go through all these stories, right, you see that goes away, right? So you lose, like, there is an element where he kind of shows you in the beginning that, which I'm assuming is a stand-in for himself to some capacity because he wasn't drafted, right? March isn't drafted. He joins the Marine Corps willingly to go fight. So there's an element of him, which I'm thinking that's sort of his, maybe a glimpse into his mentality going into it ready to fight, right? And then by the end of the war, it becomes a pointless thing to him, right? It's just pointless killing to an extent. And I think that probably to a degree maybe answers your question, which there's also this kind of parallels to Junger's point he makes, I think, in Storm of Steel, where he talks about how to have the balance, you need these young, eager men that are ready to go die, but you also need the sort of the battle-hardened sergeants and higher enlisted guys who've seen that to kind of temper them as well.
Right. And it's also like, I've read a lot about Frederick the Great and this army that he inherited. It was the greatest army in Europe at the time. And his father didn't, he was so enamored with this fantastic army that he had that he never used it because he didn't want to lose it. But at the same time, armies are there to be, there's no point in having the shining armor if it doesn't get tested. There's no point of having this great navy stay in port all the time. And there's definitely got to be a balance there. And we could go into civilian control of the military and the idea around that being, well, less wars will happen because there won't be these bloodthirsty generals getting us into every fight. But now it's these bloodthirsty civilians with no skin in the game that are sending the armed forces around the world.
Yeah, because from their perspective, war is almost, it's an abstract, right? Because one, they've never experienced it, and two, they're not going to have to, at least in theory.
It's not something for them. There's a certain
Right.
there's a warrior caste uh, that they keep hermetically sealed unless completely necessary. But that's not this book. This book
No.
is we see young men volunteering. Uh, I think in the second chapter you have a guy who is later killed in the book from another person's perspective, but in his perspective, he's talking about how he can take on the whole German army himself, sort of thing. Uh, he believes himself invincible, and then he's actually he gets killed actually by his own officer later in the book because the officer tells a sergeant to go create an observation post ahead of the line. The sergeant says, "Sir, I don't know about that. The Germans have that pretty pinned down. As soon as we get out there, they're just gonna their artillery is zeroed in on that spot, and we're just gonna get killed." Officer says, you know, basically do what I say, or go, goes kick rocks. And the sergeant goes. He takes four men, and they all die.
Right.
And
Yeah, because that ends with the lieutenant. What he's crying out that he didn't know, he
yep,
didn't
yep,
mean to.
he didn't mean to. It's not his fault. And I think, and that's actually an interesting point that we can go down. I was in the army, right? I was enlisted as you said you were enlisted too, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So enlisted guys and officers obviously don't mix. And what I actually haven't met as many officers to get a feel for what they think of their enlisted. I can't imagine that they think we're kind of boorish and unrefined, which probably true. Uh, and we think that they're retarded. I think that's even good officers. There's definitely the butter bar, right? Lieutenant.
Right.
He's he's so fresh and so new, but he has so much authority that
Well, yeah,
it's
he
almost
doesn't.
paradoxical right there.
Right. Well, he doesn't have the experience and he has the schooling, right? And I think, not to jump off on a tangent too much about this, but you see that element here where he's telling them to do something that by the book probably makes perfectly logical sense, right?
Right.
But the sergeant, which we're assuming has more experience than him and understands this, is telling him that that doesn't work. And one thing I didn't see in the book at all really is you don't really ever see any perspective from higher enlisted. There's no like first sergeant, sergeant majors,
There's a first
gunnies.
sergeant.
Well,
There's let me. I had it right here. He's just very early on. Uh, page 16, First Sergeant
uh,
Boss.
is that the one where he's talking about like how inexperienced or fresh they
Yeah.
are?
He's
Yeah,
like he's very grizzled and
right. Well, and that's what I was going to say is like that position of that higher enlisted guy's job is to sort of provide that experience with a little more authority because he's been around long enough. So you pair them with that young officer to kind of temper them, and I didn't see that here. Right? There's no hardened first sergeant standing next to the lieutenant saying, "Hey, that's a stupid idea. Don't do that." You just have this sergeant who can somewhat voice his opinion, but like you said, enlisted guys are basically just told what to do, so he just goes and does it, even though he thinks the lieutenant's retarded.
right. And I think that's also maybe we can say that an innovation of the Second World War is the uh, you know battles
Like,
are fought at company level, let's say, and maybe in Vietnam at platoon level. So more authority is given to the non-commissioned officer class.
yeah,
Whereas
you
in World
see
War One,
that evolution of
it's
small unit leadership.
yes, that's the term that was escaping me.
Yeah, I think that's what that's a good point because I didn't consider the fact that that probably hadn't evolved to the point that it is today. Because the officers of the First World War still kind of carry a little bit of that Napoleonic authority from like the Napoleonic Wars, right?
Right, right. You could almost picture, a grand marshal sitting in a balloon, trying to see why one army isn't running out of the trench while the other is far ahead. Uh, Actually, we were before we went on the air, we were talking about the made for TV film, The Lost Battalion, which we both enjoyed, and how an entire battalion of soldiers is surrounded because they don't get the order to retreat in time.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that they find themselves, completely trapped behind German lines, way ahead of the American advance.
so in the book, sorry, and kind of a feature more than a bug of my style of talking is the tangents. So for the listeners out there, I do apologize, but that's probably where the most meat of the content comes. But in the book, we start with they kind of go through not basic training, but they're mustered up together. They get some liberty and they're shipped off to Europe. They do a little bit more training and they get their first taste of combat. And we have to remember also that I mean the Americans they're only in the war for about a year, maybe a year and some change. But the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, they've been at it for 3-4 years at this point.
Right. Yeah, and you
But
see that when they show up in France and they're eager, right? They get off the ships and they're eager and excited and ready to fight, and they encounter the old woman or they encounter the crowd of French that are all dressed in black, and they can't
mhm.
figure out why they're essentially, they're in mourning, and an English speaking woman, basically yells to them that, don't you know there's a war going on here? And it kind of hits them a little bit at that point that, like, okay, maybe there's something else going on here, because they're just eager to fight. They have no concept of what's about to happen. And outside of the book, and anybody who knows anything about World War I history kind of knows that one of the reasons the U.S. takes such massive casualties in this conflict is because when they show up, they don't take any of the lessons the Germans and French have already learned, right? They just go into fighting the way that basically the French and Germans fought at the beginning of the war.
I think yeah, and I think that I mean they talk about American innovation, like for the longest time the British were trying to figure out how to destroy barbed wire to get into the enemy trenches. The Americans just put down plywood and walk over it.
Yeah.
And then and obviously the Germans are upset at the American war crime known as the trench gun.
The shotgun, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's definitely like, and the book shows the growing pains of the American Expeditionary Force, but the Americans learn how to be cruel very quickly. There's none of this old world. You get the sense that the Americans won't be having a Christmas truce. And I mean the Christmas truce that was all the way back in 1914, so there probably wouldn't be one regardless. But it's not even thought of. You have the Captain Matlock in the book. He captures some prisoners and he tells his men to execute them.
Yeah, that's probably. I mean, I do want to get to that. I think though that is one of the more important stories that comes out of the book. But I was going to say that there is a story. There is almost a Christmas truce moment, because if you remember, there's a point late in the novel where there's a lake